Preston Vance set the check on Colt Briggs's kitchen table without being asked to sit down. $310,000. Colt looked at it the way a man looks at something left on his property without permission. He did not pick it up. He did not lean forward to read the number more carefully. He already knew the number. Vance had made sure he knew the number before he ever walked through the door, as men like him always did, softening the ground before they brought the machine. Colt folded the check once and held it back across the table. Vance had never had anyone do that before. He stood there with the check in his hand and his smile still arranged on his face, and for just a moment, something behind his eyes went very still. Then the smile adjusted itself, like a man finding his footing on uncertain ground, and he set the check back down on the table as if Colt had simply misunderstood the gesture. Colt pushed back his chair and stood up. That was the whole conversation. Vance talked for another 4 minutes after that, about market conditions and soil remediation costs and the difficulty of operating marginal land in a rising interest rate environment. And Colt listened to all of it from a standing position near the door with his coffee mug in his hand. He did not argue with any of it. He did not agree with any of it. When Vance finally stopped talking and looked at him, Colt said he had cattle to check and opened the back door. Vance picked up the check on his way out. He did not say goodbye. Colt stood on the porch and watched the black Land Cruiser back down the gravel drive. And he thought about his father, the way he sometimes did when something happened that Harlan Briggs would have recognized without needing it explained. Harlan had dealt with men like Preston Vance his whole life under different names and different arrangements. Men who arrived at a farm with a number already decided and called the visit a conversation. Harlan had never sold to any of them. He had also never had the money to replace what age and weather and thin margins took from the land. And that tension between holding and maintaining was the thing that had occupied most of his life without resolution. Colt was 58 years old. His wife Margaret had been gone 4 years. He ran 38 cow-calf pairs on 340 acres in Sullivan County, Missouri, and the operation was not failing, but it was not comfortable. And the difference between those two conditions had been narrowing for longer than he liked to think about. The North 80 was the problem the way it had always been the problem. 80 acres on the north end of the property, separated from the main pastures by a seasonal creek and a fence line that needed work in 4 places. The ground ran to broom sedge and cedar sprouts and a stand of wild plum that had been expanding for 20 years without anyone's encouragement. There was a pond at the southeast corner that held water reliably through May and sometimes into June, and then became a mud flat with a cracked skin and a smell that the cattle avoided by the middle of summer. Beyond the pond, nothing. The county had written it as rough pasture for tax purposes because there was no better category for it. The bank read rough pasture and understood brush. Roy Tatum at Meridian County Bank had sent his man out in May. A younger fellow named Gareth Decker, who had moved up to loan officer 2 years ago from a position in commercial accounts. Decker had walked the property line on the south end, looked at the north 80 from his truck, and gone back to the office and written what everyone had already decided was true. The report arrived on a Thursday. Colt read it at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee. North 80, degraded scrubland, no certified water source, no established forage stand, contributory value to borrowing base 0. That last line cost him $18,000 in operating credit, not because anyone had decided to punish him, because the numbers on the page were what they were, and the bank lent against what the numbers showed, and the numbers showed 80 acres of brush that produced nothing and supported nothing and would continue to do neither for the foreseeable future. The report was not wrong about what it saw. Colt understood that. He had looked at the North 80 himself plenty of times and seen mostly the same thing. He drove to the feed store in Milan that afternoon for mineral tubs, and Dale Weaver was loading sacks into his truck in the parking lot. Dale was 62 and had farmed the adjacent section for 30 years and had sold 90 acres to Meridian Land Capital the previous fall for $420,000. He talked about that transaction the way some men talk about a winning hand at cards, often and with detail. Decker finally put it in writing. Dale said when Colt pulled in, everybody already knew what that ground was worth, which is nothing. Colt asked the clerk about the mineral tubs. Dale kept talking. He was not a malicious man in the ordinary sense. He was a practical one. And practical men in Sullivan County in 1986 had looked at the economics of marginal ground and drawn the same conclusion in roughly the same order. The cash had been real. The relief had been real. And once a man had made a decision like that, he found it useful to believe that everyone else should make the same one. Your daddy never could make that ground pay, Dale said. No shame in it. Some land just isn't meant for cattle. Colt loaded the mineral tubs and drove home. He had 38 cow-calf pairs depending on an operating loan that was now $18,000 lighter than it had been the week before. He had a fence to fix in 4 places before he could even think about putting cattle on the North 80. He had a pond that went dry by July in most years. And he had a piece of ground that the county, the bank, Dale Weaver, and the man from Meridian Land Capital had all independently arrived at the same conclusion about, which was that it was not worth the trouble of a second look. Colt did not disagree with most of that assessment on the surface. He just was not finished looking yet. His father, Harlan, had farmed this ground for 31 years before his heart gave out in the spring of 1979. Harlan had been a careful man, the kind who wrote things down not because anyone asked him to, but because he believed that observation without record was just forgetting in slow motion. He kept a spiral notebook for breeding dates, and a separate one for equipment repairs, and a third one he called the land book, which was where he wrote down things he noticed about the property that did not fit anywhere else. Colt had the land book in the drawer of his desk. He had read it through twice after Harlan died, and a few times since. Most of it was the kind of notation that made sense only if you knew the land it referred to. Wet corner northeast of the creek crossing in March. Muskrat activity along south fence increasing. Cedar line moving east faster than expected. Observations stripped of wishful thinking. The record of a man watching something over a long time without forcing an answer. There was one passage Colt had read more times than the rest. Harlan had written it in July of 1971, in the middle of a dry summer, not unlike the summers that came to Sullivan County every few years. It was 3 sentences. North ground does not hold rain the way the south fields do. It holds something older than rain. Walk it in August when the rest is burning, and you will see what I mean. Colt had walked the North 80 in August. He had walked it several times. He had not seen anything that the sentence made him expect to see, which he attributed to not knowing exactly what he was supposed to be looking for. Harlan had that quality sometimes in the land book, a confidence in the eventual legibility of things that Colt found more frustrating than reassuring. He did not think about those 3 sentences again until the 19th of July, 1986. It was a dry month across Sullivan County. The pastures running east toward Green City had already started going from green to that particular dull olive that everybody in farming country recognized and nobody liked seeing before August. Colt was walking the fence line on the North 80 with a roll of wire over his shoulder, checking the 4 breaks that needed patching, and he stopped because something was wrong with what he was seeing. There was a strip of grass cutting diagonally across the pasture. It ran from the upper corner near the old fence line down toward the ditch at the southeast end, and it was green, not the green of a lawn or a watered field, not the kind of green you would point out to a stranger driving past on the county road. Green the way the rest of the field was not, a strip maybe 10 feet wide where it started near the fence, widening to something closer to 25 feet farther down, running close to 280 yards before it disappeared into the blackberry along the ditch bank. On either side of the strip, the broom sedge had already gone the color of old copper. The cedar sprouts were showing drought stress at the tips. Everything that was not the strip had already started the slow surrender that dry Julys extracted from marginal ground in this part of Missouri. The strip had not surrendered. Colt stood at the fence with the wire roll still on his shoulder and looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything because there was no one to say anything to. He pulled the small, spiral notebook from his shirt pocket, the one he used for breeding records and vet appointments. and he wrote 4 words and the date. Green line, North 80, July 19th. Dry both sides. He went back the next morning with a length of quarter-inch steel rod from the truck and probed the ground. Outside the strip, 20 inches down, the rod hit dry, packed clay. He had to lean his full weight on it to get that far. Inside the strip, 18 inches down. The rod slid into something cooler, and the end came back slightly tacky with moisture. He walked the strip from the fence line to where it ran out at the ditch, probing every 15 feet, and the pattern held the entire length. Dry and packed outside the line, cool and damp inside it. Consistent depth, consistent moisture. At the ditch end, the strip disappeared under a stand of blackberry thick enough that he had to turn sideways to work through it. The ground under his boots changed in the last several feet from damp to genuinely wet, half buried in root mass and silt. Packed solid with decades of debris was a corrugated metal pipe end, roughly 10 inches across, with a ring of roots grown straight into the opening. Colt crouched down and looked at it for a while without touching it. Someone had laid drainage tile across this pasture a long time ago, long before he was farming it, maybe long before Harlan was farming it. A tile line meant to carry subsurface water off a low spot, probably put in during a wet period when that low spot was causing enough trouble to justify the work. At some point, the outlet had clogged with roots and silt. The water had nowhere to go. So it had done what water always does when it cannot move forward. It had spread sideways and downward and settled into the path of least resistance, which happened to run diagonally across the pasture in a line that followed the natural grade so gradually you would never see it from the road or from a truck window or from anything less than 280 yards of slow walking in a dry July. Harlan had known. Colt was certain of it before he even went back to the barn. The 3 sentences from the land book were sitting in his memory and rearranging themselves around what he was looking at. North ground holds something older than rain. Walk it in August, when the rest is burning. Harlan had not been speaking in metaphor. He had been describing a physical fact about the ground in the only language available to him, which was the language of a man who had walked the same acres for 30 years and written down what he saw before he always knew what it meant. The barn had 3 outbuildings. The smallest was the one Harlan had used for tools and seed storage, a structure Colt had not fully cleaned out since 1979 because the task kept moving down the list behind things that were more immediately necessary. He went there after lunch and started pulling things out from the back corner where Harlan had kept his hand tools. Under a canvas tarp that had not been lifted in years, beside a set of soil augers with wooden handles smooth from use, he found the toolbox. It was oak, built by hand, with a clasp latch and Harlan's initials burned into the lid. Inside, under the top tray of wrenches and pliers, was a Maxwell House coffee tin with a red lid, the metal slightly oxidized along the seam. Colt pried off the lid. Inside was a piece of graph paper, 16 by 20 inches, folded 8 times to fit the tin. He unfolded it on the barn floor carefully because the creases had become fragile with time. It was a map, hand-drawn in pencil, with Harlan's particular careful lettering marking distance in measured paces and splay-handed fathoms. The North 80 drawn from memory and from walking, with every fence line and the pond and the ditch bank and the blackberry stand all in their correct positions, and running diagonally across the pasture from the upper fence corner to the ditch, drawn in a double line with cross-hatching between them and notations every 30 feet or so indicating depth measurements, was the tile system. Harlan had mapped the entire thing, not just the outlet Colt had found, the full run. 290 yards of agricultural tile laid at a consistent depth between 16 and 20 inches, draining a low spot at the northeast corner of the pasture that would otherwise stay wet enough in normal years to discourage good grass establishment. The tile had been installed, according to a note in the margin, sometime in the 1930s based on the pipe type. which Harlan had identified as the older corrugated metal rather than the clay tile that came into common use later. At the bottom right corner of the map, in Harlan's handwriting, B. Begun. March 1958. Last walked July 1961. Harlan had been mapping this since before Colt was old enough to follow him to the field. He had walked it, measured it, recorded it, and then folded the record into a coffee tin and put it under a tarp in a toolbox in the back corner of a storage building. And he had never said a word about it to his son. Colt sat on the barn floor with the map in his hands for a long time. He was not angry about the silence. He understood it as sons understand the silences of practical fathers, which is slowly and without complete resolution. Harlan had known what the tile line was. He had also known that knowing what something is and having the resources to act on that knowledge are two entirely different conditions. And he had spent most of his life in the gap between them. The map was not a secret. It was a record kept against the day when the gap might close. Colt folded the map back along its original creases and put it in his shirt pocket. He drove to Milan the next morning and spent $96 on a soil test for the ground around the green strip and the higher ground above it. Results came back inside 2 weeks. Acid enough to need lime, which the broom sedge had already communicated for free, since broom sedge does not establish thick on ground that does not need it. He spent an afternoon with the legal pad he used for the farm's accounts and worked through the numbers as Harlan had worked through numbers. Stripped of wishful thinking, just the arithmetic of what was possible against what was required. The bank's current value on the North 80, using Decker's zero contribution figure, brought the effective per acre number for that ground to $95. 80 acres at $95 came to $7,600. Improved rough pasture with developed water. The category on comparable ground 2 sections east that Colt had checked in the county records ran $260 to $290 per acre. The midpoint was $275. 80 acres at $275 came to $22,000. The gap between those two numbers was $14,400. That was the figure he kept returning to. Not because he could capture all of it immediately, not because the bank would recognize it right away, but because it told him the distance between what the appraisal saw from the road and what was actually under the ground was large enough to be worth the work of proving. He did not have money to fix 80 acres at once, and he knew it before he started, so he did not try. He started with 24 acres, the most responsive ground around the strip, and limed it that fall for $1,540. He seeded it to orchard grass and clover for $680. He fixed the 4 fence breaks and added cross fencing to give himself paddock control for $1,350. He hired a man from Stoutsville with a small backhoe to open the ditch in and clear the tile outlet properly for $740. He left the rest of the 80 alone. Total outlay $4,310. Dale Weaver drove past in October and saw Colt working the fence line and pulled over. He looked at the thin new seating on the strip and the disturbed ground at the ditch end and shook his head in the manner of a man who has already reached his verdict and is only filing the evidence. Throwing good money at bad ground, Dale said. Your daddy tried to make that field pay for 40 years. Didn't happen then. Won't happen now. Colt kept working this fence post he was setting. Dale waited a moment longer and then drove on. Gareth Decker called in November about the operating loan review and told Colt, not unkindly, that one season of seeding and a thin stand on 24 acres did not change anything on paper. There was no production record. There was nothing to show the bank except money spent. The borrowing base stayed where it was. Colt said he understood and hung up the phone. He sat at the kitchen table that night with Harlan's map unfolded in front of him and the legal pad beside it, and worked through the numbers again, not to find a different answer, but to make sure he was asking the right question. He was not trying to fix all 80 acres. He had never been trying to fix all 80 acres. He was trying to establish what was already there. which was a subsurface water source that had been functioning continuously since before anyone currently farming this county was born, and 24 acres of ground with the right soil chemistry and the right drainage and the right seed to become something the bank could read. That was a different project than what Dale Weaver thought he was watching. It was also a different project than what Gareth Decker had written into the appraisal. Neither of them had walked to the ditch end. Neither of them had pushed a steel rod into the ground on a dry July morning and felt the temperature change at 18 inches. Neither of them had found the coffee tin. Outside, the November wind came off the north field and pressed against the kitchen windows, and the pipe Colt had cleared in August was somewhere out there in the dark, running its slow seep into the ditch below, indifferent to appraisals and truck windows and all the accumulated weight of other people's conclusions about what a piece of ground was worth. Preston Vance called in early December. He had heard, through channels Colt could not identify precisely, that the bank had declined to improve the borrowing base on the North 80. He expressed sympathy. He said the offer of $310,000 remained available, and mentioned, without quite saying it directly, that the flexibility of that offer tended to decrease over time as the consortium's planning commitments solidified. He used the word solidified twice in the same conversation. Colt let him finish. Then he said the land was not for sale. Vance said he understood and that he would be in touch. After he hung up, Colt poured the last of the coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking north toward the dark shape of the tree line where the North 80 ended. He thought about his father walking that ground in 1958 with a tablet and a measuring stick, working out the path of something underground that no one else had thought to look for. He thought about the map folded into the coffee tin, waiting 25 years for someone to need it. Harlan Briggs had not been a man who talked about what he knew. He had been a man who wrote it down and put it somewhere it would keep. Colt finished the coffee and washed the mug and turned off the kitchen light. There was nothing to say yet. The ground would say it when it was ready. The winter of 1986 passed in the ordinary way of working farms, one task replacing the next in an order determined by weather and animal need rather than preference. Colt fed the herd through January and February on hay he had put up the previous summer, watched the new seeding on the North 80 go dormant under 2 light snows, and kept the tile outlet clear of ice with a steel bar on the mornings when the temperature dropped far enough to matter. The strip itself was invisible under the frost. There was nothing to see, and nothing to show anyone, and nothing to do but wait for the ground to do what ground does when you give it time and correct chemistry and leave it alone. Spring came in March, and the orchard grass came up thin in places where the seedbed had crusted after a hard rain in late October. Not a failure, not what he had drawn on the legal pad either. Something in between, which is where most first-year seedings lived, if you were honest about it. The clover established better than the grass in the lower section near the strip, which told him the drainage was functioning as the tile map said it should, pulling enough moisture up through the root zone to favor legumes over the broom sedge that had been the previous occupant. Colt noted all of it in the spiral notebook and left it at that. Dale Weaver came by in April, not to talk about the North 80 specifically, but about a tractor part he needed to borrow. And while he was in the yard, he looked north over the fence with the particular expression of a man who has predicted failure and is tracking its progress. The stand looked thin from a distance. Colt knew it looked thin. He did not explain what thin looked like in a first-year seeding on limed-out broom sedge ground because Dale had not asked. The second call from Vance came in May of 1987. The number had moved, $340,000, delivered as simple arithmetic, as if the increase were a courtesy extended to someone who had not yet understood the original offer. Vance had a quality Colt had noticed in the first visit and confirmed in every conversation since, which was that he spoke about inevitability as some men speak about weather, as a condition that existed independent of anyone's preferences and could only be prepared for, not prevented. The consortium's planning timeline was advancing. The logistics corridor required contiguous parcels. The North 80 was the last piece. These were not arguments. They were descriptions of a reality that Preston Vance believed Colt would eventually agree to inhabit. Colt said the land was not for sale. Vance said he would be in touch. What Colt did not know in May of 1987, and would not know until Nora worked it out 14 months later from a sequence of dates and documents, was that Vance had already been in contact with Gareth Decker, not about the North 80 specifically, about the operating loan review schedule and the collateral assessment procedures at Meridian County Bank and the particular mechanisms by which a loan officer conducting a routine annual review might legitimately request an independent technical assessment of a property whose value had been disputed. These were not illegal conversations in isolation. They became something else in combination with what Decker did next. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early June of 1988. Colt was in the equipment shed when his daughter pulled it from the mailbox. Nora had driven down from Kansas City for the weekend, nominally to help with fencing on the east pasture, but also because she had been watching the farm's financials from a distance with the particular attention of someone who understands numbers and does not like what a sequence of them is suggesting. She was 28 years old and held a degree in agricultural engineering from the University of Missouri, and she had her mother's habit of reading documents completely before reacting to them. She read the letter twice standing at the mailbox. Then she walked to the equipment shed and handed it to her father without saying anything. He read it once. Then he set it on the workbench and went back to what he was doing, which was adjusting the tension on a belt drive that had been slipping under load. Nora waited. Meridian County Bank had conducted an accelerated collateral review of the Briggs Farm operating loan, effective immediately, pursuant to a routine assessment of credit quality in the agricultural portfolio. The review had incorporated an independent technical analysis of subsurface water availability on the north parcel. Based on the findings of that analysis, the bank had determined that the contributory value of the North 80 remained at zero and that the overall collateral position of the loan had deteriorated below the required coverage ratio. Under the terms of the original loan agreement, the bank was exercising its right to demand full repayment of the outstanding balance within 60 days. $67,000, due by the first week of August. The independent technical analysis was a ground-penetrating radar survey conducted by a firm out of St. Louis. The report summary described no viable subsurface water in the north parcel and characterized the ground as consistent with the original appraisal assessment. The survey had been conducted in April. Nora said, quietly, that the timing of the review was not routine. Colt finished adjusting the belt tension. She said the loan agreement allowed for accelerated review under specific conditions, and that those conditions had not been met in the ordinary sense, which meant someone had found a mechanism inside the agreement's language to initiate this outside the normal annual schedule. She said she wanted to look at the full loan documents and the technical report from the radar firm. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and told her where the loan documents were. He did not tell her about the coffee tin or the map yet. He did not tell her about the notebook entry from May of 1986 or the full sequence of conversations with Vance. He let her come to what she was going to come to through her own sequence, because that was how Nora worked, and because some things needed to be found rather than handed over. The radar report arrived by mail 3 days later. She spread it on the kitchen table next to the loan documents and a topographic map of the North 80 she had pulled from the county extension office and spent most of an evening with it. Colt sat at the other end of the table working through a repair estimate for the hay baler and did not interrupt her. Around 9, she looked up. She said the survey equipment had been calibrated for type B clay soil conditions, meaning low moisture mineral clay. Sullivan County's subsurface in this section ran high in oolitic clay with elevated moisture retention, which behaved differently under ground-penetrating radar. In type B calibration, the signal returned from moist oolitic clay at 16 to 20 inches depth was interpreted by the instrument as undifferentiated dense substrate, meaning it registered the same as dry-packed ground with no water movement. The entire survey had been conducted with the wrong baseline assumption for this soil type. Every reading in the report was technically accurate for the instrument settings used, and technically meaningless for the actual ground conditions. She set it with the same flat precision she had used on the calibration problem. It was a specification failure. The mechanism Decker had used to call the loan was built on a document that did not meet the regulatory standard for its intended purpose. Colt set down the Baylor estimate. He went to the barn and came back with the Maxwell House tin. He pried off the lid and took out Harlan's map and unfolded it on the kitchen table next to the radar report. Nora looked at it without speaking for a long time. She looked at the double line running diagonally across the pasture, the depth notations, the margin note about pipe type and approximate installation date, the initials and the years at the bottom right corner. She said, "Who drew this?" Colt said his father had, starting in 1958. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked if there was a physical outlet. He told her about the corrugated pipe end at the ditch. He told her about the depth readings with the steel rod in July of 1986. He told her the outlet had been running a slow seep since he cleared it, through dry fall and hard winter and dry spring, consistent and unmeasured and ignored by everyone with a professional opinion about what that ground was worth. Nora looked at the map for another moment. Then she looked at her father. She said, "You have been sitting on this since 1986. He said he had not been sitting on it. He had been working it. She looked at the map again and did not argue with the distinction. The 60-day clock was running, $67,000 by the first week of August. The operating loan represented the full working capital of the farm, the money that funded feed and fuel and vet bills and seed from one harvest cycle to the next. Without it, the farm did not stop immediately. It slowed first, as a machine slows when the fuel line starts to restrict, imperceptibly at first and then all at once. Colt ran the numbers on the legal pad the night after Nora left for Kansas City. He could sell the fall calf crop early, which would bring in somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000 depending on weights and market, and lose next year's breeding base in the process. He could approach a private lender, which meant interest rates that would make the Meridian terms look generous. He could sell the South Pasture, which was his best ground and represented more than half the farm's production capacity, and use the proceeds to retire the loan and restructure around the remaining acreage with a smaller herd. Or he could do what he had been doing, which was make the North 80 prove itself before someone else decided what it was worth. The problem was the timeline. 60 days was not enough time to produce a grazing record. It was not enough time to finish a second growing season. It was not enough time to do anything that Gareth Decker would recognize as evidence in a collateral review. What 60 days did include, if the summer went the way it was setting up to go, was the driest stretch of July and August that Sullivan County had seen in years. The signs had been accumulating since late May, rainfall totals tracking below average for the third consecutive month. Soil moisture readings from the Extension Office showing subsoil depletion moving faster than the seasonal average. Old-timers in Milan talking about how dry winters preceded dry summers more often than not in this part of Missouri. Colt had been watching it build as he watched everything, quietly, with the notebook in his shirt pocket. The heat arrived the second week of July and did not leave. By the 18th, the county road dust hung in the air for 20 minutes after a vehicle passed. The ponds on the east pasture were down 3 feet from their normal midsummer levels. Pastures that usually held color into August had already gone the dull olive that meant the grass was pulling back into its roots and waiting. Cattle stood in fence-line shade in the middle of the day and did not graze, a signal that preceded real trouble by about 2 weeks if the rain did not come. Dale Weaver started hauling water on the 22nd. He had a parcel of rented ground east of town, 80 acres he had leased after selling his own place to Meridian, and the pond on that parcel went dry for the first time in the lease's history. He contracted a man from Paris with a tank truck, $42 a load, and the cattle needed 2 loads a day. Colt learned about it from the man who ran the feed store, who knew about most things in Sullivan County within 48 hours of their occurring. The North 80 had changed from what it had been in July of 1986, Most of it showed the same tired color as everything else in the county. The broom sedge on the untouched 56 acres had gone the color of straw and stayed there, but the 24 acres around the tile line, 2 full seasons of lime and seed and managed grazing, carried differently. A farmer standing inside the paddock could feel the difference underfoot before he saw it in the color, the strip itself. The original 280 yards running from the upper fence corner to the ditch stayed productive in the way that mattered, which was not dramatic but was real, the kind of real that showed up in cattle weights and hay receipts. Colt moved the herd through carefully, using the cross fencing he had added 2 years earlier to control how long each group stayed on any given paddock. 7 days on, 14 days rest, adjusted when the grass showed pressure. He never let them hit the strip hard. He had learned that in the first season and did not repeat the mistake. On the 31st day of the dry stretch, the strip began to show stress at the north end. He noticed it on an evening walk. The color shifted from its usual tone to something slightly yellowed in a 10-yard section near the fence line. He crouched and pushed the steel rod into the ground. The moisture was there at 18 inches, but the rod came back with less tackiness than it had carried in previous probings. He walked the rest of the strip and found the same reduction in 2 other sections. And he went back to the barn and got Harlan's map and spread it on the tailgate in the last of the evening light. The map showed 4 junctions in the tile system, places where the original installer had connected lateral runs to the main line. 2 of those junctions were in the section showing stress, which meant either the lateral connections had degraded at those points after 50 years of root pressure, or there was a blockage somewhere upstream reducing flow to the main line. Either way, if the flow dropped much further, the moisture advantage would fail before the drought broke, and if the strip failed before August ended, there would be nothing to show anyone. 24 acres of stressed seeding on ground the bank had already written to 0, and the note coming due in 4 days. He called Nora that night. She drove down from Kansas City the next morning, arriving before 7 with coffee in a thermos and her field boots already on. Colt met her at the truck and handed her the map. She studied it for a moment, oriented herself to the pasture, and pointed to the section between the 2nd and 3rd junction markers. She said that was where she would look first. They dug by hand. He had a long-handled spade, and Nora had the shorter one from the equipment shed, and they worked the ground along the tile line at the point she had identified, moving through the first foot of topsoil and into the clay subsoil below it. The temperature dropped noticeably as they went deeper. At 22 inches, they found the tile, a run of the older corrugated metal pipe in better condition than Colt had expected, and they followed it toward the junction. The blockage was roots, not a gradual infiltration, but a concentrated mass at the junction itself, a place where 2 sections of pipe met with a clay sleeve fitting that had cracked slightly over time, opening a gap large enough for fine roots to enter and, over the course of years, fill. The root mass was dense enough to reduce flow through the junction to less than 20% of the pipe's capacity. Nora cut the roots with the pruning saw she had thought to bring. Colt cleared the debris from the downstream section with a length of flexible rod. They worked for 2 hours in the heat, crouched in the trench, and when she pulled the last of the root mass free, the flow change was immediate and audible, a low movement of water through the pipe that had not been there before. At the bottom of the trench, in the loose soil below the cracked fitting, Colt found a short section of pipe that did not match the rest of the tile system. It was clay, not corrugated metal, older than the installation Harlan had mapped, and it ran perpendicular to the main line in a direction that Harlan's map did not show. He cleared the soil from one end and found that it connected to a second lateral, shorter than the main ones, running toward a low corner of the pasture that Harlan had labeled on the map as wet in March. Harlan had known about the main system. He had not known about this extension, or he had suspected it and not confirmed it before July of 1961 when he wrote his initials on the pipe and folded the map and put it in the tin. Colt measured the approximate length of the additional lateral where it disappeared into undisturbed soil. 14 acres. If the tile was continuous and functional through that section, there were 14 acres in the northwest corner of the North 80 that had subsurface drainage running under them that no one had ever counted. He did not dig further that afternoon. There was not time, and he was not going to tear up more ground than necessary on a deadline. He covered what they had opened, tamped the soil back, and marked both ends of the new lateral with fence posts. That evening, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the loan document spread out and her laptop open and a legal pad filling with notes in her mother's small, exact handwriting. Colt made coffee and left her to it. Around 10, she called him back to the table. She had found what she was looking for in the loan file, in a section covering conditions for accelerated review. The language required that any independent technical assessment used to trigger an accelerated review had to be conducted by a licensed assessor operating under the standards of the Missouri Agricultural Lending Regulatory Framework. The ground-penetrating radar report from the St. Louis firm bore the signature of a licensed civil engineer, not a licensed agricultural assessor. There was a difference. In Missouri in 1988, a civil engineer could assess structural integrity and soil load-bearing capacity. Agricultural collateral valuation for lending purposes required a separate licensure under a different regulatory body. The radar report was technically competent work by a licensed professional who was not licensed to do what the bank had used the report to do. She said it the same way she said everything that mattered, without emphasis, letting the fact carry its own weight. Colt looked at the legal pad where she had written the statute citation. He pulled the small spiral notebook from his shirt pocket and opened it to the entry from May of 1986, 2 days before Gareth Decker had submitted the original appraisal. 2 lines, between a note about a heifer with a foot problem and a reminder about a mineral delivery. Decker and Vance. Lunch. Milan Cafe. 11:45. He had written it because he wrote down things he noticed, as Harlan had written down things he noticed, before he understood whether they would matter. He set the notebook on the table beside Nora's legal pad. She looked at the entry for a moment. She said, "You wrote this 2 years ago." He said he had written it the day he saw them. She looked at her father for a long moment in the manner she sometimes looked at things she was recalculating. Then she picked up her pen and wrote the date below the citation. Outside, the night was dry and still. Somewhere to the north, the pipe Harlan had marked with his initials 27 years ago was doing what it had always done. Indifferent to the 60-day letter, indifferent to everything. The calf crop on the east pasture had lost 2 pounds of average daily gain in the past week from the heat. The North 80 cattle had not lost a pound. The numbers told the rest without being asked. 51 tons of hay equivalent in grazing days at $78 a ton, $4,000 not spent, 2 loads of water a day at $42 over 31 days, $2,600 Dale Weaver had paid that Colt had not, the well he had not needed to drill, the calf weight he had not lost. The ground was making its record in the worst possible conditions, in the driest summer Sullivan County had seen in a decade, against a clock with 22 days left on it. Harlan Briggs had started walking that ground in 1958. He had measured it with his hands and his feet and a pencil on graph paper and left it for the person who would eventually need it. Colt gathered the notebook and the map and the loan documents and stacked them on the corner of the kitchen table. He turned off the kitchen light and stood at the window for a moment, looking north at the dark. Then he went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the cattle settle for the night. And after a while he slept. The 22 days remaining on the letter passed the way deadline days always pass on a working farm, with enough ordinary labor to fill them and enough silence between tasks for a man to think about what he was not talking about. Colt fed the herd. He checked the tile outlet each morning as part of his route, crouching at the ditch end to confirm the seep was still moving. He rotated the cattle through the North 80 paddocks on the schedule in the notebook. He did not call Gareth Decker. He did not return the message Preston Vance left with the answering service in the 3rd week of July. a message expressing continued interest in the property and a willingness to discuss terms that reflected the current market environment. Nora drove back down on the first weekend of August with a file folder and the focused quiet that meant she had been working on something in the interval. She had filed a formal complaint with the Missouri Division of Finance 10 days earlier, on the grounds that the accelerated collateral review had used a technical assessment document produced by a professional not licensed for agricultural lending, collateral purposes under Missouri statute. She had attached the radar report, the relevant licensing statute, the civil engineer's credentials, and a one-page summary of the discrepancy. She had not told Colt she was doing this while she was doing it because she did not know yet whether it would produce anything, and she did not want to give him a number before she knew it was real. The division had responded, not with a resolution, but with an acknowledgement that the complaint had been referred to the Agricultural Lending Oversight Section for review, and a notice to Meridian County Bank that the accelerated repayment demand was under regulatory examination and could not be enforced during the review period. The 60-day clock had stopped. Colt read the letter from the division twice. He set it on the table beside her folder and looked at it as he had looked at the original demand, without visible reaction, which was not the same thing as not having one. He asked how long the review would take. Nora said probably 60 to 90 days, long enough to get through the end of the dry stretch, long enough to have something to show an independent assessor when the time came. He nodded once and picked up his coffee. August settled over Sullivan County with the full weight of what it had been building toward since June. The heat was not dramatic in the way that newspaper descriptions made heat dramatic. It was simply present, as poverty is present, not as an event, but as a condition that organized everything around it. The cattle moved differently in it. The morning chores that usually took 90 minutes took 2 hours because nothing could be hurried without cost. And the North 80 held. The 56 untouched acres of broom sedge and cedar had gone the color of everything else in the county, pale and flattened and waiting. But the 24 improved acres carried their condition into August in a way that nothing else on the farm did. The root depth was there. The drainage was there. 2 full seasons of management had built something that a single dry summer could stress but not break. Carl Bowden had been recommended by the Missouri Agricultural Assessors Association. Nora had called the association's referral line in early August and asked for an assessor with experience in subsurface drainage evaluation and established pasture valuation in north-central Missouri. He had 31 years of field experience and had never worked for Meridian County Bank or any of its parent institutions, which was the first thing she had checked before she called him. He arrived on a cold, clear morning in the first week of November. The drought had broken in mid-September, a week of slow, steady rain that brought the county back from the edge without the drama of flooding, the kind of rain that soaked in rather than ran off, which the soil had been ready for. The pastures had greened again across Sullivan County, including the 56 untouched acres of the North 80, which had recovered as broom sedge always recovered. Efficiently and without encouragement, the 24 improved acres had come back differently, with the density and root depth of an established stand rather than the thin, quick green of annual recovery, a distinction visible to someone who knew what to look for. Carl Bowden knew what to look for. He was a compact man in his early 50s with a canvas coat and boots that had seen real field work. He shook Colt's hand in the yard and did not catalog the farm from the driveway. He asked to start at the north fence line and work south, which was the direction that would show him the tile outlet last, and Colt said that was fine. They walked as Colt's father had walked ground, slowly and without a fixed destination within each section, pausing to crouch and examine grass density or push a heel into the soil surface to check moisture retention. Carl Bowden did not make declarative statements while he walked. He wrote in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil and asked questions when he needed information. Practical questions about the seeding dates and lime applications and the grazing rotation schedule, which Colt answered from the spiral notebook in his shirt pocket with the dates and tonnage and paddock intervals recorded in sequence. At the second paddock, Carl crouched and parted the grass stand with both hands and looked at the thatch and root structure at the soil surface. He said, "This is second-year establishment minimum. maybe moving into third. Colt said it was third year in the upper paddocks, second year in the lower section where the seedbed had set back after a hard rain. Carl stood and wrote something without saying what it was. They reached the ditch end in the late morning. The blackberry stand had been cut back partially in the course of clearing the outlet, and the corrugated pipe was visible from 10 feet away, a slow, steady seep running from it into the ditch below, even in the dry conditions of early November, when everything else in the county was dormant. Carl stood and looked at the outlet. He pushed his boot against the soil beside the pipe and watched the way water seeped back into the indentation. He asked where the source was. Colt said it came from a tile system laid across the pasture, probably in the 1930s based on the pipe type, draining a low area at the northeast corner. He said there was a map. He took Harlan's map from his inside coat pocket, folded to the quarter that showed the tile layout, and held it out. Carl took it and looked at it for a long time, tracking the double line with one finger, reading the depth notations in the margin. He looked at the initials and dates at the bottom right corner. He asked if HB was Colt's father. Colt said it was. Carl refolded the map along the original creases and handed it back with a care that suggested he understood what he was holding. He wrote for longer in his notebook than he had written at any other stop on the walk. They came back to this farmhouse around noon. Nora had driven down that morning and was at the kitchen table with the file folder and the previous appraisal documents laid out. Carl sat across from her and spent 40 minutes reviewing everything she had assembled. The original Decker appraisal, the radar report with the calibration issue annotated in her handwriting, the Division of Finance complaint and the regulatory hold, and the 2-season records from Colt's spiral notebook, the seeding dates and lime receipts and grazing intervals, and the hay equivalent calculation from the drought period. He read through all of it without comment. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at Colt. He asked what the original appraisal had put on the North 80. Colt said 0 contribution to borrowing base, $95 per acre on rough acreage value. Carl wrote a number on a blank page of his notebook and turned it around on the table. $268 per acre. Improved rough pasture, developed subsurface drainage, established forage stand, demonstrated drought resilience. 80 acres at $268 came to $21,440. Against the original bank figure of $7,600, the difference was $13,840 in additional collateral value, enough to restore the borrowing base past the coverage ratio that had triggered the demand letter, enough with the regulatory hold already in place to make Gareth Decker's mechanism unworkable. Nora looked at the number and then looked at her father. Colt looked at it for a moment. Then he asked Carl how long the formal report would take to prepare. Carl said 2 weeks. He said he would note in the report that the previous assessment had failed to identify a developed water source due to survey methodology limitations. He did not say the previous assessment was wrong. He said it had not walked far enough to find what was there, a distinction that meant the same thing and carried less accusation and would therefore be harder to argue with. After Carl left, Nora gathered her documents back into the folder. Colt poured the last of the coffee into 2 mugs and set one in front of her without being asked. She said, "What happens now?" He said the report goes to the bank. The Division of Finance completes its review. The loan gets restructured on the new collateral basis. She said, "And Gareth Decker?" Colt said the division would handle what the division would handle. That was not his business to manage. She looked at him in the manner she had when she thought he was understating something, a particular quality of attention that did not press but did not release either. Then she let it go and picked up her coffee. She asked about the second lateral, the clay pipe section they had found in the trench in August, the one that did not appear on Harlan's map. Colt said he had flagged both ends, had not dug further yet. She asked how many acres he estimated. He said 14, if the pipe was continuous. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that 14 additional acres with functioning subsurface drainage, if it assessed the same as the tile system, would put the North 80 total improved acreage above the threshold for the next collateral tier at the bank, not just restoration of the original borrowing base. An increase. He had run that number already, the night they found the secondary lateral on the same legal pad. He had not mentioned it because the primary system needed to be proven first, and because adding an unknown into a regulatory process was not something he wanted to do until he knew what it actually contained. He told her he would dig it out in the spring. She said she wanted to be there. He said she could be there. 2 weeks later, Carl Bowden's formal report arrived by mail, 12 pages with field photographs and soil sample data and the final valuation language. Nora filed it with Meridian County Bank's Commercial Lending Department and simultaneously sent a copy to the Missouri Division of Finance with a cover letter noting that the independent assessment had been conducted under proper agricultural lending licensure. In contrast to the document used to initiate the accelerated review, Gareth Decker did not call. The bank's response came from a different name, a senior loan officer from the main branch in Moberly named Patricia Holt, who introduced herself on the phone in a tone that had none of Decker's casual familiarity and all of the careful precision of someone handed a file and told to resolve it without additional complications. She said the bank had reviewed the Bowden assessment. She said the collateral position had been recalculated. She said the accelerated repayment demand was being withdrawn, and the loan was being restructured on the new collateral basis with a standard annual review schedule going forward. She did not mention Gareth Decker by name. She did not explain what the Division of Finance review had found. She said the bank regretted any inconvenience and that the new loan documents would arrive within 10 business days. Colt said he appreciated the call and that he would look for the documents. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the ordinary silence of a November afternoon, on a farm where the work had been done and the animals were settled, and there was nothing requiring immediate attention. The plain white envelope arrived on a Thursday in December, postmarked Jefferson City, where the Missouri Attorney General's office kept its main operations. No return address. Inside was a single photocopied sheet announcing the suspension of Meridian Land Capital LLC's agricultural land acquisition activities, pending investigation of irregularities in collateral documentation submitted to multiple Missouri lending institutions. 14 pending transactions. Frozen. The investigation covered 3 counties. The notice was addressed to no one in particular. It was the kind of document that got filed in institutional records and occasionally found its way to interested parties through the ordinary movement of paper. Colt did not know who had sent it. He did not try to find out. He read it once. He folded it once. He carried it to the barn and opened the toolbox and put it inside the Maxwell House tin, on top of Harlan's map, and pressed the red lid back into place. He did not mention it to Nora immediately. He told her in the spring, on the morning they came out to dig up the secondary lateral, when she asked whether anything further had developed with Preston Vance. She read the notice standing at the tailgate of the truck with her field boots on. She read it through twice, folded it on the same crease Colt had used, and handed it back without saying what she was thinking. Then she picked up her spade and looked toward the fence posts, marking both ends of the secondary lateral in the northwest corner, still standing exactly where he had left them the previous August. She said, "Show me where to start." They dug from the eastern post toward the west. The soil came up in the heavy, slightly tacky way of well-hydrated subsurface clay, darker than the topsoil above it and cooler on the hands even through work gloves. At 19 inches, they found the pipe. It was clay tile, 4-inch bore, in better condition than either of them had expected. Older than the corrugated metal of the main system by the look of it, laid in the dry stack method without mortar that farmers in this part of Missouri had used from the 1890s through the early 1920s. The joints had stayed tight because the clay had swelled with moisture and held its own seal across decades. No root infiltration, no fractures in the sections they exposed. Colt cleared the upstream end with a flexible rod and found clean flow almost immediately, a stronger movement than the main line had shown when he first cleared it, because the source drainage area in the northwest corner was lower and held more seasonal water. Nora probed the ground ahead of them with the steel rod and marked the tile's path with short stakes as they uncovered it, and the line ran exactly as he had estimated, west-northwest, toward the low corner. A continuous functional system that had been draining that 14 acres since before anyone currently alive had put a plow into Sullivan County soil. Harlan had not known this one was here, or he had suspected it and not confirmed it before July of 1961, when he wrote his initials on the pipe and folded the map and put it away. Either way, it was there, running quietly under 14 acres of scrub that every appraisal had written to zero, and the ground above it had been showing that to anyone willing to look at the right time of year in the right conditions. They finished in the early afternoon and filled the trench back and tamped the soil flat. Nora updated the map, adding the secondary lateral in pencil as Harlan had drawn the primary system, with depth notations and the date and the measured length in paces. At the bottom right corner, below Harlan's initials, she wrote her own, N.B., April 1989. Colt looked at it for a moment without saying anything. He took the map and refolded it along its original creases, with the new section folded to match, and put it back in his coat pocket. They drove back to the farmhouse and Nora made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the ordinary way of people who have been working outside for several hours and are now inside and warm. The farm sounds came through the walls, cattle at the hay rings, a gate chain moving somewhere in the yard. Normal sounds, the sounds of a place that was still operating. Nora wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at the table for a moment. She said, "He mapped all of it that he could find. He just did not know where all of it went." Colt said that was probably right. She asked whether Harlan had ever said anything about it directly. Not the map, just the ground itself. He thought about a July afternoon, sometime in the early 1970s, himself young enough to be following his father rather than working alongside him, walking the north fence line after a dry spell that had turned the county its familiar color. Harlan had stopped at the corner where the strip showed against the surrounding ground. He had stood there a while in the manner he stood at things he was thinking through. Then he had said what he said about the ground holding something older than rain, and walked on without adding to it. Colt told Nora about that afternoon. He told her what Harlan had said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was right." Colt said he was. The coffee cooled in the mugs. The afternoon light crossed the kitchen floor in the slow angle it made in early spring, low and unhurried, moving from the east window toward the far wall at a pace that would finish its work before either of them had reason to notice it was done. Nora drove back to Kansas City late that afternoon. Colt stood on the porch until the truck disappeared behind the tree line at the county road. Then he stood there a while longer. The North 80 was not visible from the porch at this hour, the light too low and the tree line too dense. But he knew what was out there. He knew it as a man knows the dimensions of a room he has lived in long enough that he no longer needs the lights on to move through it. 38 acres of improved pasture where Decker's pen had written 0. A tile system that had been moving water since before Colt learned to walk. Through every drought and freeze and every decision made by men who had not looked past the end of a truck window, 14 acres in the northwest corner that Harlan had not mapped because he had not had time, and which a spring morning and 2 spades had now added to the record. The ground did not know about any of the rest of it. It did not know about the notice in the coffee tin, or the regulatory hold, or the phone call from Moberly, or the 14 transactions frozen across 3 counties. It had been doing the same work since long before any of that existed and would be doing it long after. That was the part Harlan had understood and tried to say in 3 sentences in the land book on a July evening in 1971. That was the part Colt had finally found the words for. Not to say aloud to anyone, but to hold in the way a man holds something true that required a long time and a great deal of work to reach. He went inside as the light failed. He put Harlan's map on the kitchen table and looked at it one more time, the full sheet unfolded, the original pencil lines and the new ones together on the same paper, the old handwriting and the new. Then he folded it back along every crease it had ever known and carried it to the barn and put it in the coffee tin and pressed the lid back down. He set the tin back in the toolbox, under the top tray, where Harlan had put it. He closed the latch.